Okay, well, we will launch, even though people are still starting to come in. Welcome to Race and Medicine. This is the third part of a three-part series on race in science, technology, and medicine. We've been doing this all year. I think this is our 24th event. As you know, this is both a speaker series and a course. So some people attending are taking this for credit under these course numbers below. We have had numerous co-sponsors. There are 19 units altogether that sponsored the series, and I won't take the time to read all these names, but we're very grateful to the people and the programs that co-sponsored with us in STS and have provided funding and also recommendations for speakers and helped with logistics and everything else. So it's really a huge all-campus effort. We always begin with a land acknowledgement to the Muwekma Ohlone tribe, which is the land that Stanford sits on. It was and continues to be of great importance to them. So consistent with our values of community and diversity, we recognize our responsibility to acknowledge, honor, and make visible the university's relationship to Native peoples. And Jasmine will put the full land acknowledgement in the chat, including a link so that you can visit their website if you'd like to learn more about them. They are still around. Next week, we have Dr. Tara Diener, who is a postdoc at Stanford and a lecturer in the Writing and Rhetoric program. She will be speaking on something related to the social production of maternity statistics in Freetown, South Africa, where she's done a lot of research. She is a really interesting person. She was a registered nurse before she went to graduate school and had a whole career doing that. So I invite you to come and visit with her next week. And before we begin, some reminders. Please keep your microphones muted. Undergrads, please put your full name in the chat and leave your video on if you can. For those of you who are not undergraduates joining us, please remember that priority in our question and answer session goes to our undergraduate students. We will use and recognize comments and questions from faculty and staff if there's time, so feel free to enter them in the chat. And as always, especially given our subject, please be respectful and kind. And I have to say, just for 1 minute here, that this series began with the Black Lives Matter protests of last summer that began after the killing of George Floyd by Derek Chauvin, who was convicted, rightly so, yesterday of his murder. And we are grateful for that small step toward justice. And now I'll turn it over to Jasmine to introduce our speaker for today.
Thank you. And I just want to echo exactly what Paul was saying. For those of you who maybe like me have been carrying the weight of this last year in your body, I hope that you're caring for yourself. And if you're not feeling joy today, then at least I hope you're feeling some relief. I can say that I was overwhelmed by how emotional I was yesterday. And some of you may be in that position and just want to create space to recognize that this class is a legacy of George Floyd's life, and we just want to honor that today. So with that in mind, I am really excited to bring to introduce you all to our speaker for today, who is Professor Subini Annamma, who we are just so excited to have get to share kind of her work here. And so prior to her doctoral studies, she was a special education teacher in both public schools and youth prisons. She received her PhD in special education and teaching at University of Colorado at Boulder. And currently she is an associate professor in the Graduate School of Education here at Stanford University. Her research critically examines the ways students are criminalized and resist that criminalization via processes that animate entrenched inequities, while recognizing the mutually constitutive nature of racism and ableism, the interlocking with other marginalized oppressions, and how these intersections impact youth education trajectories in urban schools and youth prisons. Furthermore, she positions students as knowledge generators, exploring how their narratives and ingenuity can inform teacher and special education. Dr. Annamma's book, The Pedagogy of Pathologization, which came out in 2018 with Routledge, focuses on the education trajectories of incarcerated disabled girls of color and has won the 2019 AESA Critics' Choice Book Award and the 2018 NWSA Alice Pietmeyer Book Prize. With that in mind, please join me in welcoming Professor Subini Annamma.
Oh, thank you. I see some little clap hands and someone. Thank you. Good to see you all. It's so odd to have like a, oh, you don't have to join in, but it's nice to see you all. I want to say thank you so much to Paul and Jasmine for inviting me, and Jasmine especially for doing all these complicated logistics that it takes to get somebody to do these talks. So I just want to acknowledge that. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen, which we always get this really awkward moment where you're like wondering if it works. So let's see if we can get it going. All right, everyone see that? Thank you I'm seeing a couple of thumbs up, so I'm going with it. So a couple of things I want to say is, first, because I consider myself a public intellectual, meaning I do not believe that the knowledge we generate should be locked in within the ivory tower. Feel free to share quotes from this talk on Twitter, and you can tag me at Dr. Subini. You can use the hashtag DisCrit, which I'll talk about more in a moment. And then I want to talk about the title of this talk because it is a mouthful: Transformative Praxis Using DisCrit to Disrupt the School-Prison Nexus. So I'll talk about what all that means. But first, I want to follow in the footsteps of folks who've already started and recognize some gratitude and recognition. So I live in San Francisco and I work in Stanford. And so these are the unceded lands of both the Ramaytush and the Muwekma Ohlone people. Given that all institutions and our lives exist on Indigenous lands, I offer gratitude for the pedagogy and learning that takes place on these lands. I hope we can all enter with gratitude and work to be in good relationship with these lands and the Indigenous people who are still here. This land acknowledgement is not just an acknowledgement, but a call to act against injustice, to act with memory, and to consider Indigenous and multiply marginalized perspectives. I also want to start with these three babies. In the last week, police have summarily executed Adam Toledo, age 13, Micaiah Bryant, age 16, and Anthony Thompson Jr., age 17. I just want you to look at their faces for a moment. I want you to sit with the realization that we are still in a society, even though we had an individual conviction of a cop who killed a Black man, George Floyd, which I am so grateful for, but I also want to recognize how this does not equate to justice, and that all these children are being blamed for their own deaths because they had a gun or they had a knife, or in the case of Micaiah Bryant, because she was in a fight, right? So all these children are being blamed for their own deaths. So I just want to sit with this, because what I write and speak about Black and brown kids just like these three kids. And what we're going to talk about today is what would have happened if they hadn't been executed, and where they would have ended up, which is in youth prisons. And so I want to understand that these kids have had what Ruthie Wilson Gilmore calls organized abandonment in schools and communities, where they're abandoned by the state. However, it's not just abandonment they face, it's also a reinvestment into carceral settings, including policing, foster care, youth prisons, and other systems set up to apply carceral logics, which I'll talk about a little bit later. Finally, I always want to honor the people who are resisting intersectional oppressions every day, from those who march, to those who write, to those who teach about injustice, and to those who learn, and to those who resist in other ways. We fight in a myriad of ways. We are here because we continue to stand and roll against injustice and towards remembering and building. So back to diagramming the name of this talk. Let's see that title again. Here it is. I don't want to be an academic who just uses big words to use big words. I want to be one that is continually thinking about the power of language in our work. I also understand that we may use multiple definitions of the same term, so I want to make clear what I mean when I say what I mean. So let's start with transformative praxis. I draw from Yamamoto. who reminds us that we develop theory to inform practice, and practice then pushes us to rethink theory. It's transformative because it recognizes to move society towards justice requires going beyond shifting individual circumstances to changing societal structures. So to me, transformative praxis means a theory-informed practice that focuses on eradicating intersecting oppressions. So now we diagrammed transformative praxis. So let's examine DisCrit, or what I call, what we have named as disability critical race theory, and why I engaged in developing this theory to inform my practice. I want you to know that I was a special education teacher in majority Black and brown schools and youth prisons before I was an academic. If the fact that I want to diagram a sentence didn't give me away already as a teacher. But my teaching practice, including and especially considering my failures as a teacher, have always informed my theorizing. Though I got my BS in special education, a bachelor's of science way long time ago, with an emphasis on working with students with emotional disabilities, and my MA in special education and teaching English as a second language, race was rarely mentioned in my education. I learned about race and racism from my students along with my own schooling experiences. And my students taught me about the overrepresentation of youth of color in special education. So when I got to my doctorate, I used my teaching practices to inform my theorizing. So here are some DisCrit tenets informed by my research, practice, and theory. The social co-construction of race and disability has always been at the center of labeling, surveillance, and punishment, considering ways those outside of desired norms have had their rights terminated and their personhood questioned. From drapetomania, a psychiatric diagnosis that supposedly caused slaves to run away, to dystasia, a disease created to describe when slaves broke their tools and refused to work, to several other examples, including the Chinese Exclusion Act and indigenous boarding schools, all of which claim people of color were racially inferior in mind and body throughout our history. Non-white race bodies and minds have always been linked with deficit in a system of white supremacy. This linking of racial difference from whiteness as inherent deficit continues today. White bodies and minds are the norms that everyone else is compared to. In schools, this is enacted when white history is taught in classes, except for a few months of the year devoted to certain groups. White ways of learning are equated with being smart, and white standards of behavior are rewarded. In general, then, white supremacy then is simply the commitment to valorizing whiteness while erasing the oppression and resistance of multiply marginalized people of color. That is not to say white people are the problem, but the belief that white is best, the standard bearer, the norm, white supremacy is the problem. So I always put this slide up when I talk about DisCrit because these are our intellectual ancestors. And I always want to name them because we don't come up with ideas on our own. And one of the things about schooling is we can focus so much on individual learning that we forget about the lineage of learning we have and who we want to credit that for. So from Sojourner Truth to W.B. Du Bois, to Anna Julia Cooper, to Derek Bell, Audre Lorde, Kimberly Crenshaw, Chris Bell, Nirmala Aravallis, all of these folks, and of course, many more that I didn't list, are all kind of the intellectual lineage of this idea of DisCrit, disability critical race theory. And the affordances of this conceptual framework. So why do I use this? What does it give me? First, it begins with the recognition that racism and ableism are normal, not aberrant or unusual. Bodies different from the ideal are identified as problematic. Second, once identified, those differences are more likely to be constructed as deficits and pathologized through a system of labeling. Third, those labeled deficits or disabilities are then viewed as needing to be remediated, rehabilitated, or redistributed into spaces less visible. So let me unpack some of this. So first, beginning with the recognition that racism and ableism are normal, not aberrant, bodies different from the ideal are identified as problematic. When discussing racism, and I always like to do this because people use the word racism all the time, and I'm not always sure what they mean by that. So when discussing racism, Ladson Billing notes, in a racialized society where whiteness is positioned as normative, everyone is ranked and categorized in relation to these points of opposition. In Latson Billings' definition, we witness how whiteness is positioned as normal and how all of us Black, Indigenous, and people of color are imagined as abnormal. What Kumari Campbell's definition adds is what normal means in terms of thinking, emotions, and the divide that happens between normal and abnormal. So Kumari Campbell, I'll just read part of it, is the notion of the normative and the normal and the enforcement of a divide between perfect humanity, how humans are supposed to be, and the aberrant, the unthinkable. But again, I had to put these two definitions together because what I want to make clear is that ableism does not only happen to disabled people, it happens to all people of color. That's what I mean when I say the two are mutually constitutive. Such an annoying term, but it's so useful because they inform each other. When someone sees our race or hears our accent, in other words, when we are constructed as Black, Indigenous, Latinx, Asian, or other people of color, we are imagined as less than in intelligence and/or behavior. Thus, racism and ableism are co-constructed. What happens to youth of color with disabilities is that racism and ableism are exacerbated, magnified, and the harm is also more impactful because they are more vulnerable. Second, once identified, those differences are more likely to be constructed as deficits and pathologized through labeling. So in education, normal is secured by routing specific children out of particular opportunities. So historically, this occurred, one example is in boarding schools for Indigenous children. Here, children were ripped from their families and Native culture was treated as a disease. In fact, a famous person named Colonel Pratt said at one point, the philosophy is that all the Indian there is in the race should be dead, kill the Indian in him and save the man. This type of segregation and eradication of difference has been common in education, and it's rooted in both racism and ableism. Said differently, education has often been used as a tool to surveil in order to eliminate difference and conform to a standard of whiteness. Those who cannot or choose not to conform are labeled as less than, segregated, and punished. When these mutually constitutive processes of racism and ableism are enacted in schools, they hold up traditional notions of normality in learning and behavior. DisCrit then is helpful because it identifies how classrooms reproduce inequities and commits to consciously disrupting them. Yet it adds to many critical theories by examining how racism and ableism, along with other intersecting oppressions, intertwine to determine whose bodies, minds, and behaviors have value and who is disposable in our classrooms. Yet education remains steadfastly color evasive. So I want to just pause here again, because I'm going to use a word and I want to make sure everyone knows what I mean by this word. So color evasive is an alternative to me, a better description of what some people have called color blindness. So we build off of Neil Gatonda's work, who is a critical race theorist and a legal scholar. And the reason why is because when we talk about color blindness, we're using disability as a metaphor. Race scholars often use disability as a metaphor. Racism cripples, deaf to the argument on racial injustice, short-sighted views on racism. Yet people with physical disabilities experience racism. Deaf people can listen to complex arguments, and nearsighted people understand complex situations. So again, those metaphors don't hold up. However, an inability to see is not ignorance. Blindness provides unique ways of understanding the world to which sighted people have no access. So again, this is that deficit rooted, which is very ableist, where we associate blindness with ignorance. But color blindness, the phrase and the term also has a sense of passivity, and that is not benign. The use of blindness and color blindness locates the problem and power within an individual. If you would stop paying attention to race, it would go away. Not only is this a form of gaslighting for people of color and teachers and students, it denies the systemic violence of racism that impacts their daily lives, not just through individuals, but also through institutions. In the context of white supremacy, actively avoiding talking about race is a form of power hoarding. In other words, to use the term evade highlights an attempt to obliterate. Color evasion is anti-Blackness and ableism, and combined, we need to name it as such. So let's move on. So again, the third tenet of DisCrit is those labeled with deficits or disabilities are then viewed as needing to be remediated, rehabilitated, or redistributed into spaces less visible. So what do I mean by that? So we heard the historical arc of how racism and ableism are built into our society and also into our schools, right? And so now we're going to look at more recent kind of what's happening currently. So disability labeling can be both a promise to afford tools and resources, but it can also sediment racial and gendered inequalities. We need to grapple with both realities, yet we can't understand that if we're being color evasive. So DisCrit requires us to explore who is actively enabled by our classroom and who is debilitated. So what I mean by that is research has found behavioral standards in schools are set on norms of white children, and those who do not possess that whiteness are less likely to be rewarded even when they display the expected behaviors. So I'll give you an example of this later on when we talk about hand raising. Those who are dynamically discouraged from accessing curriculum are then further from the desired norm at the intersections of various oppressions. In other words, DisCrit names how the social construction of deficit based on distance from the standard has material realities. So again, this is a lot of words. So what do I mean by this? So students with disabilities are overrepresented in discipline and incarceration, particularly when intersecting with race. So let me give you an example of this. This graph is discipline data broken down by race and gender. I believe this is from 2017, 2018. Boys are on my left, girls are on my right. So let's look at girls because often there's a hyper focus on boys, but girls of color are also overrepresented in school discipline. So what we see here when we click is that white girls make up about 2% of suspensions. So see that red arrow then with the teal bar, that's what that shows. And then we look at Black girls are suspended at higher rates, nearly 6 times as high, 12%, more than any other girl of any race or ethnicity, and most boys. So first of all, just note that. We've got 2% of white girls, 12% of Black girls being suspended. So that's an extreme variance, an extreme inequity that needs to be fixed. Also, I really want everyone to know, just pause with me here, because as soon as people say this, they say, well, what are those girls doing, right? But continual research the majority of research has shown that there is no difference in behavior, that we are choosing to single out particular kids. So hold on to that for a minute. So this is students receiving out of school suspensions. So this is students with disabilities receiving. So when we add disability to race and gender, we see that every racial group, including white children, so again, here I'm over here on the right-hand side, are suspended more than their non-disabled peers. As you may recall, Black girls without disabilities are suspended at a rate of 12%, but Black girls with disabilities are almost 20%, so almost 1 in 5. In other words, disability labels do not protect children of color from disciplinary actions and instead may even make them a target. So it's important, but the important thing beyond the fact that we haven't been able to show a difference in behavior is that we do know that discipline disparities are directly related to criminalization, since just one suspension can double the likelihood that student will drop out of school or be pushed out, and more like it, and increase the likelihood that students end up in prison. So why does that matter? So let's give you examples. So children who do not respond well to being targeted for labeling, surveilling, and punishment are often sent to youth prisons. For example, in 2016, 66% over here on the left, by the way, of the total males incarcerated shown in this first pie chart are males of color. Meanwhile, 61% of females are females of color. So though rarely discussed, disabled students are also overrepresented in incarceration, particularly when intersecting with race. So again, disability can advantage some, creating access to higher education by providing testing accommodations on the SATs and other things for white upper class students. Think of the scandal of admission scandal that touched on at Stanford, which that was definitely an issue. While it can leave students of color with the same disability labels in more restrictive settings with lower graduation rates, higher push-out rates, and incarceration rates. So I'm just going to real quickly, so nationally in public schools, so you'll see this top graph in public schools, the youth with disabilities make up about 12 to 14% of the full public school population. When you look at youth prisons, that jumps to 33 to 37%. So proportionally, youth with disabilities make up a much higher rate of incarcerated kids. And then what disability matters? So students of color, students with ED, emotional disabilities, are less than 1% of public schools, but they are almost 50% of youth incarcerated. And that matters because ED, emotional disability, there's an overrepresentation of Black children in it. So we're skipping that one. Whoops, now I went too far. Okay, so I'm going to briefly touch on methods, but I know it's starting to get a little long. So I think what I'll do is just briefly mention the methods of these 3 projects. So I'm combining information from 3 different projects. So project 1 was working with incarcerated girls. So this is the work that came out of the book that some of you might have read a chapter out of. So if that was a maximum security, private contract, female only. And then the other place was an open door facility, mixed gender, served up to 65 students. So really different placements. And one was actually considered a step down to the other placement, but I think they were both important because they both were really committed to kind of carceral logics, in the sense that you couldn't, even though one place was called open door, if the kids left without permission, a warrant would still be issued for their arrest. So like you can leave the doors open, but you still have the threat of carcerality always over you. So those are the 2 different places there. In this one, I had 10 participants, 6 Black girls, 3 Latinx girls, and 1 Native student. Racially, by the way, I used the terms the girl identified themselves. Because this study used a broader definition of disability, all 10 had a disability label. And one demographic I had not planned for, but that ended up being really significant, was sexual diversity. 5 identified their sexual orientation as straight. 2 identified as lesbians, meaning they had only, they at a certain point in their lives dated females exclusively. And 3 identified as sexually fluid, meaning they were open to date either males or females. So that meant that of my 10 students, half were identified as queer. In the second project, this was a much bigger project. So that first one was in the youth prison, and the second one was in public schools. We interviewed 51 girls of color, 11 school personnel, and 11 family members. And the goal here was to get a better sense of school discipline, and it was for girls who had and had not been disciplined. So either girls talked about their own experiences or what they witnessed for other kids. And the third project was also with girls of color, focused on another maximum security prison, where I went in with 2 doc students, and we spent a year teaching in a youth prison. We taught a socio-critical literacy class, it was called. And so again, there's just these lists of data, but so I'm not going to go through all that right now, but I'll give you a sense of it. What I want to give you one last sense of, and then we'll keep moving, is this idea of methodological pluralism, but also this kind of geographical scale in which we ask questions and gather data around. So I never look for an individual by themselves. We always look at the way they're positioned and the sociocultural context in which they're positioned. So you can see that what I did in that first study, the one that turned into the book, how we collected data at each level, each scale, to get a broad sense of this deep phenomenological work. So results. So one of the things that we found is something called debilitating processes. And we define these as teacher activities that disrupt engagement, meaningful learning, and safety and security in the school. These processes foreclose access and inclusion for disabled youth of color. So I was talking to a teacher, and she said, Ms. Cradler said, these girls are very criminal. Don't ever forget that. And I said, when you say they're very criminal, why do you say that? And she said, why do I say that their behavior is very criminal? I mean, they're looking for exciting ways. I mean, it's not always about the relationship or in person. It's about the excitement that they feel doing something wrong. When I say it's criminal, it's all about how to get around the system to get what they want. And that feeds right back into their criminal mentality. Not that kids aren't master manipulators. I was a teenager. I manipulated my parents. That's our job, you know? The difference being when you get to the power and control piece, that's where it's a little different than when it's on the outs. So this labeling, I argue, was a huge part of this, what I call the pedagogy of pathologization. This label was more than about producing stigma, though these labels did indeed stigmatize. The label produced targets for exclusion. So an example of this is this idea of hyper-labeling. So think about if everything you did when you did something wrong, or you tried to get away with something, or you were doing something you knew you weren't supposed to be doing, was not only labeled as wrong, it was labeled as something so purposefully criminal, it kept you away from, you had to be locked up to stay away from other kids. And that was the narrative that went throughout the time that I worked with incarcerated girls. And it's really common in youth prisons. So an example is one of the days I was teaching, or I was in the school, and I was observing in this youth prison school. One of the girls, the teacher got up to go do something, turned her back, and one of the girls swiped an answer key. And then they passed it around and everyone cheated on the test. And I'm sure you were all perfect in school. You're all perfect Stanford students. You never do anything wrong. But some of us have done things wrong before. Me might have been one of them, probably not. Since this is being recorded, I'm not confessing to anything. But what I want you to understand is that most of us have broken the rules a time or two. We might have even cheated on the test. But what happened for these girls is there was a whole big thing made of it, and it was all about their criminal thinking, how abusive they were, how they were hungry to get power. It wasn't just a teenager stealing an answer key because the teacher turned their back. So that's what I mean about labeling. The label becomes so powerful that every behavior that the kids do is translated through that label. So what I found was that this labeling of a criminal identity, criminal behavior, and criminal thinking was laced through the discourse and socializing practices of both sites. School personnel's constructed girls' identities as criminal was to label all the behavior as criminal, something more sinister than normal. All 9 of the teachers in the study who I interviewed talked about this criminal thinking. It was an ideational artifact that predicted how teachers responded because teachers believed girls motivated, their criminal thinking motivated their behavior. This labeling of criminal impacted the ways curriculum was structured. So let me give you an example of that. Oops, oop, oop. Uh-oh. Sorry, Mike, I've got the pinwheel going around. Okay. So this is from my field notes at the place where I so this is a different project. This is when I was going to teach at the youth prison. So this is my first day just observing in the class before I take over the class. And so as the literacy class starts, I am introduced and the girls are instructed to start their work. So so just to give you a sense, they're all sitting at computers. None of them are in what you might consider a normal classroom. They're all around the edges of the classroom, all on their own computer. Well, that sounds nice, right? Extra technology. Now, none of these computers could get on the internet. By the way, these computers were at least 15 years old. I mean, they were old, the constantly freezing, crashing, really common stuff in prisons. You have very little access to the internet. But so the girls I moved from computer to computer talking to the girls. One is reading a passage about Amazon's new voice feature. Another is reading about hair products. A third is reading about natural disasters. The teacher says this is a research-based reading program guaranteed to raise the literacy achievement of these incarcerated girls. I asked the teacher what books the girls are reading. She said, these girls need to learn about organization. So they are reading The 7 Habits of the Highly Effective Teenager. I'm just pausing to stare into the camera because I don't know if you can imagine being forced to read The 7 Habits of the Highly Effective Teenager. I'm sure you all had to read that in high school. But I ask if they are reading any fiction. She responds, they do that independently, and shows me the girls' library, a renovated supply closet with books lining the walls. So really, I want you to understand that that the curriculum was also built around this idea of criminal thinking. These girls are disorganized, they're bad, everything about their learning had to be about changing their behavior. So not only did they not get to read, they got to read 0 fiction, 0 books for pleasure, 0 books as a class. Everything they had to do was on their own. And the things that they were reading were I don't know how nicely to say it, except quite boring. So here, criminal thinking was used to justify restrictive curriculum like the one observed in these field notes, wherein literacy practices were often inauthentic, reading disconnected passages on a computer, or focused on fixing. So one of the things I identified was this pedagogy of pathologization, and that was around this idea of hypersurveillance. And so I already mentioned hyperlabeling and how that impacted the curriculum. So now we're going to talk about hypersurveillance. So I defined hypersurveillance as the excessive scrutiny and the anticipation of problem behaviors, attitudes, or presence that was often applied to multiply marginalized girls of color. And I'm just going to pause here to mention, so the pictures that you're seeing come up are from these things called education journey maps. So when I wanted to go and do the work in the youth prisons, I wanted to do digital storytelling. Well, as I said, I found out you can't take cameras into a youth prison. You can't, there's no internet there, the computers are super slow, so that none of that was possible. So I had to go really low tech. So I created something called education journey maps. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on them right now, but if you all want to hear more about them, I can talk about this method as one that's really powerful and that I use now continually, but you'll just see those across in the next couple of slides. So once girls became hyper-labeled as different, deviant, and disabled, there was an increase of surveillance of their behavior. However, the cycle could be initiated by another construct. So you could be surveilled for an obnoxious behavior, such as being friends with a troublemaker student, and then could be labeled with other unwanted identities. Moreover, one could be caught up in the web of punishment, being a spectator at a fight, and then be labeled in surveils. The point is, the cycle of hypersurveillance often led to pedagogy pathologization. So girls were aware of this surveillance, and here's a few examples that they mentioned. Erica said to me, they would do stuff with the class, and my teacher would then send me to the special ed place, so I couldn't do any of the stuff that they were doing. Erica felt that the special ed place was a location for kids who are watched and deemed not capable and punished by being sent there. Even if this isn't how the teachers imagined special education, Erica associated it with being pathologized. Another student, Sapphire, and I were talking about her struggles in school beginning when her grandmother died. And I said, well, were there any teachers or anyone who asked what was going on with you? And Sapphire replied, no, because that's none of y'all's business. I would be like, what the fuck you mean? Stay out of my business, because teachers, they're cop callers, but when you need cops, they're nowhere to be found. So here, Sapphire and Erica explicitly note how teachers were always watching to determine when they stepped out of line. And this became even more true in the youth prison where I was at, because so much of what they did was based on these behaviorist point sheets. So that's the other thing. Behaviorism comes up a lot in special education. And one of the things that, and it also comes up in medical supports, right? Especially for kids with with autism, right? ABA, applied behavior analysis. But what these kids are saying is then what happens once you get labeled, you get surveilled even closer for behaviors that people already know you're struggling with. This surveillance also influenced pedagogy. So remember, pedagogy is just a fancy word for teaching, by the way. I just always want to break that down because I think it's fun to say pedagogy, but I always want to just slow it down for a minute. So Justine discussed various pedagogies when highlighting her favorite teachers. They're like chill teachers. They don't just try to bust you out for no reason, and they don't call you out. If you don't know something, they don't call you out, and they let you decide if you want to answer a question or not. And my thing is, I just don't want to be put on blast to answer a question I don't know. It's just like, I want to be able to know and actually be able to answer. I want them to be helpful. Justine shared a very real concern that she had often been caught previously not knowing that answer and then had been humiliated. Justine named what McDermott, Goldman, and Verrain noted. These labels are not so much facts about specific children as they are mirrors to what happens in classrooms run by the survival of the show-off smartest logic of American education. All right, I'm going to go to one more and then we'll wrap it up. So a negative concept. So the final thing was hyper-punishment. So there's a hyper-labeling, hyper-surveillance, and hyper-punishment. So a negative hyper-punishment was a negative consequence in anticipation of wrongdoing or exaggeration of penalties. It's been repeatedly shown that students of color are punished more harshly for the same behaviors as white students. It has also been covered that when students of color commit the same behaviors, a second interaction is viewed as more serious than the first for students of color. Jennifer Aberhart, one of our faculty here, did a study that confirmed that. Therefore, punishment can trigger labeling and additional surveillance. This punishment is hyper then because it can happen before a problem behavior occurs, or it can be unnecessarily harsh. So when you look at Ashley's education journey map, we see the top right corner that says taking care of everybody else when I should have been going to school. So I asked Ashley what she meant by that. And she responded, like helping my siblings with food, showers, brushing teeth. And I missed so many days to help my brothers and sisters because my mom had been was on bed rest from a car accident and back surgery. I had to go grocery shopping, get everyone to school, go to my siblings' teachers' conferences, and the school just suspended me. And then, so I said, so do you feel like when you began getting suspended a lot more in 8th grade, did that have an effect on whether you wanted to go back to school? And Ashley said, yeah, like I was unwanted and I didn't want to go to school because I had tried. In middle school, I was like, they done gave up on me. That's the way it felt. Like, how are you going to kick me out of school? If you guys had any idea what I go through at home, you wouldn't kick me out of school, especially when I'm trying so hard to go. When Ashley arrived late to her own school, she would be remanded with lectures, detention, or even suspension. The school response of punishing Ashley for truancy exacerbated problems instead of alleviating them. Therefore, she was punished not just for truancy, but also for taking care of her families. So there's a whole bunch of examples of hyper punishment, but again, just to kind of keep it tight, I'm happy if you all want to talk about any more of these in the question and answer, feel free to ask about specific findings and we can go back to them. And again, I'm not going to spend a whole bunch of time on this, but I'm going to give you one example of, so this is the third project I was mentioning. And this project was the project with the 51 girls of color in school, looking at discipline in public schools. So now we're shifting from study of jails to study of public schools. And this is because, as we talked about previously, discipline disparities for girls of color are a hotspot in what I call the school prison nexus, which again, if you want to talk about why I say school prison nexus instead of the school to prison pipeline, I can do that during question and answer. So again, this was this idea of debilitating processes. And one of the things that we noticed is that girls identified adverse responses. And I was like, well, what is that? And it was basically responding to help-seeking behavior in an adverse and punitive way. So this was teachers telling students to figure it out on their own. Some students described how they are shamed publicly by teachers if they did not understand the work. So Sophia said, when you don't get it and then they get mad at you for not doing anything for the whole hour, when you don't even understand because they didn't help you. Adverse responses to students seeking academic help resulted in students not being able to get their classwork done. In both observations and interviews and focus groups, we found that this made multiply marginalized girls of color less likely to ask for help. So that was one of them. And then there's another example, which is called withholding rewards. And this was Jamelia, I'm not going to read this whole quote, but Jamelia talks about basically how she's, they have these kind of like token economies. Again, this is all motivated by behaviorism, where they have something called tiger bucks, right? And if you do something right, you get the tiger buck. And she mentions how her and other kids will be doing them repeatedly. And she says, I'll be there doing bell work and she will seriously only give them out to 2 tables. And they're filled with just like white girls and some white boys. And she won't give them to other students, like ever. She stopped, she puts them in her drawer. I watch her every day. She puts them in her drawer and after only giving them to 2 tables. So again, it's not to make this big claim like this teacher is racist, because that's not what I do. My argument isn't about that, but it's about when we are color evasive and we don't look into the deep understandings of how we reward and who we reward, we are going to reproduce racial inequities over and over again. So the last thing I'll touch on is, I know I just said the last thing, so this is the other part about me you should know. I do this a lot. Is strategies of resistance. And I know that these are probably too small for you to read, and that's okay. Really what I want you to understand is girls did not simply accept the pedagogy of pathologization. They found creative ways to resist structural and interpersonal violence and get their needs met. The point is to see the breadth and the number of strategies, the ways the girls innovated in some of the most violent of spaces. So I'll give you one quick example. So Nashana says, she's talking about, we're going back to the youth prison now, and she's talking about a punishment she's on. She says, it took a long time, like sitting in my room for 5 days. I have to realize there's no point in arguing with staff, like they're gonna win, it's pointless. And I said, well, what was the punishment like? And she said, this time it was 5 days for me. It's when you have to stay in your room. And then there's a couple of other girls in this conversation. So Amani jumps in and says, Tashana does not like to be in her room. And then Myosha starts laughing and said that whole punishment, Nash came out like every 5 seconds. And then Nishana breaks in and she's like, yeah, I popped out. Like, is she here? I need to come off. I need to process this food here. Like she's trying to get out of her room. And then Nishana kind of gets serious and she says, I hate being in my room. I hate being in a locked room because when I was little, my mom used to lock me in the basement and not feed me. It reminds me of being in that room. And yes, I have stuff in there, but I get bored and I get scared. So eventually I'm like, let me out. So Nishana discussed compliance and incarceration discourse, one that emphasizes individual responsibility for behavior while ignoring structural inequities, not as something that she internalized or believed, but that she used as a tool, as a savvy way to avoid or discontinue punishment. And that's what I want you to understand, is that all of these students figured out ways to get their needs met in a system that was designed to pathologize them. And so that's what's really cool about working with girls of color in these settings, was that they are they're creative and they're thoughtful and they are really innovative in places that we haven't had to innovate, most of us, because we aren't in youth prisons. So it was the last thing is about DisCrit classroom ecology, which is what I argue for. It was what the needed shift is in the way that teachers think. But again, that's something we can do in the Q&A if you all want to do that. So I'm not going to spend any time on that. So I'll just wrap it up here and just say thank you for taking the time to be with me. Let's do questions and answers.
Thank you so much. I'll just say I've been corresponding with a number of students who are just responding in real time to what you're sharing. And so there's a lot of deep interest in what you're saying. And one of the questions that we have that was sent to me was just asking for more resources for what it would actually look like to learn about how DisCrit and other kind of analogous approaches can help to disrupt that school to prison nexus. And I'll add on to that, if you could actually explain a little bit more about what you mean by school to prison nexus, just for folks who maybe didn't have a chance to look at your book beforehand.
Yeah, so let's start with the school prison nexus, and then we'll shift to the other part of that question. So a school prison nexus, so the reason I don't use pipeline anymore. So the pipeline metaphor was created by activists and academics in the late 90s and early 2000s. And when they created it, was a super useful metaphor. It basically made connections between schools and criminalization that prior to that had not been made, right? And it was really helpful for a lot of us who were thinking about it at that time. So the school to prison pipeline was a really useful idea. What started to happen as we studied the school to prison pipeline more is that we realized it was pretty limiting. So there's a couple of reasons for that. One is that it imagined a straight line between schools and prisons, so a really linear route. But what I found in my research, and other people have found in theirs, is there are multiple institutions. So one of the arguments is we live in a carceral state, a state that is committed to criminalizing certain people, not all people, certain people. Right. And so in that state, there are all these different institutions. Schools are one institution. They absolutely have relationships with prisons, but they are not the only institution. So for another example is ICE, right? And how ICE has created prison camps at the border for youth, for children, right? And basically made tiny human prisons for kids even younger who have committed no other crimes than have committed no crimes. So the ICE is one. So there's also child welfare. Dorothy Roberts, who if y'all don't know her work in the book Killing the Black Body, and she's got several amazing books, but she's actually has a book now that's coming out soon where she's talking about the child welfare system is really what's called the family regulation system. And that's because it is so focused on taking kids away from Black and brown moms. And if you look it up, the New York Times had a article called The New Jane Crow. And it was one way that they're saying that because Black and brown kids are being taken away from their parents for really minor issues and then put into a system. And the system is all focused on regulating them. It's not focused on getting those families what they need. It's focused again on surveillance and compliance. And so again, we start to see all these different institutions. And in fact, 9 of my 10 girls said that the first interaction they had with the carceral system was not schools, it was actually the child welfare system. That they got either taken away from their parents or their parents started to get watched, and then they started to get watched because their parents were being watched. And then they got either they ran away to get back to their parents, or then their behavior they started questioning behaviors in schools. Now, school is where a lot of behaviors and issues play out. And schools do call cops and call authorities. So I don't want to say they definitely have a really important role. They're just not the only one. So a nexus, Erica Miners describes a nexus as a web of threads, of historic threads and current threads. And so if you think of it as a web, schools are one web of many institutions, one part of the web of many institutions that are all part of this larger web of carceral logics. So that's why I talk about a school prison nexus instead of a school to prison pipeline. Jasmine, I don't remember what the second part of the question was. This happens to me a lot.
You actually helped to answer a bit of it. It was about other resources that students could look into. You referenced so many wonderful scholars who you're thinking with. But if you had any other people who are really influential in the way that you think about DisCrit, especially the way that you and your colleagues have sort of formulated that, I think the students would love to know where to look next.
Yeah, I mean, for carceral, I mean, so there's different things, right? There's understanding criminalization, and then my contribution to that is understanding how race and disability and racism and ableism have contributed to that. And so that's kind of my unique work, but I think there are other folks doing really amazing work. So Federico Waitoller, it's Waitoller, has a new book called Excluded by Choice, I believe the title is. His work is really important if you want to see how Black and Brown youth with disabilities in Chicago are experiencing choice schools. So like the whole language of school choice and how it's shifting for disabled kids of color, because choice is not the word that you would use. It's actually being pushed in and out of particular schools because, oh, we don't have the services for you here. Oh, we don't want Black kids here. Oh, we don't want kids with this kind of disability here. And so their choices are being really limited. So I would say that would be one really great book. We have an edited book on DisCrit. That was the picture I showed earlier. You are welcome to check that one out. We actually are coming out with a second edited book on DisCrit this year that should be out by the fall. But also criminalization wise, I mean, Beth Ritchie, who wrote the book Arrested Justice, Andrea, oh no, I blanked on her last name, Andrea Ritchie. Oh yeah, they have the same last name except spelled differently. Oh, Andrea Ritchie has a book called Invisible No More, which is about women of color and their experiences. So I would definitely recommend any of those. Dorothy Roberts has already said. Part of it is being able to look at different parts of a problem and put it together, right? So I can't just pull from disability research, which is historically very white and very quantitative and often very deficit based. So I've got to pull from race research, but also that ignores disability sometimes. So then I have to, you have to pull it together. So that's part of being an interdisciplinary scholar, is being able to pull from multiple fields.
Thanks, Subini. I have a couple of student questions lined up. I did want to make a comment of my own first. When you began to talk about color blindness, I had a kind of context collapse moment because I recently was talking to a landscape designer who is colorblind in the physical sense, right? And, the weirdness of that color blindness idea in the race sense, the way people use it, is that they actually are saying, I would willingly take on this disability of color blindness, so that I would not see color. And yet this man, the landscape designer I talked to, I mean, imagine a landscape designer who deals in flowers, right? He had recently received this pair of glasses. I don't know if you've read about this, but there's now a kind of glasses that can alleviate color blindness. So he put them on and suddenly he saw what most people see, all those colors. And he cried with joy for doing that. So I just think that's kind of a really useful way of thinking about what that weird color blindness idea, how you ought to really think about it, that, you ought to be joyful that you can see all the differences among people, not try to turn that off somehow so that you don't see them. Anyway, let me turn it over to the students, and I'd like to call on Jeremy Kim.
Oh, hello. Thank you so much. This was so informative. And one of the questions I've had is I've heard of this Nexus for a few years now. So I've just been wondering what have educators and education systems been doing to make these environments more humane?
Thanks, Jeremy. That's a great question. And just returning to Paul's comment for a second. Yeah, I think, there's a law professor whose last name is Obasoki, and he actually wrote this book about blind folks and their experiences with racism. Because again, it's this assumption that disability equals a lack of like, oh, well, if you can't see, then you must not be able to see race, right? But there are certainly contextual folks who, like, people understand context, and of course they understand racism. And it's one of those things that's really rooted in a deficit perspective of people with disabilities. And it's why we really want to push back on that. So I think that's just something to hold on to too. Jeremy, your question, I think, is really, really thoughtful. And the thing, I did feel a little sad because when I ended the talk, what I ended on was like, wah, wah, everything's the worst, which is, I don't want to end that way, which is why I ended with the strategies of resistance. What I've done is create, from those strategies of resistance, create a shift where we can take, instead of the 3 tenets of pathologizing, we can do what I call a DisCrit classroom ecology, where we rethink curriculum, pedagogy, and relationships. And so, for example, one of the things, so I'm just going to give you one example around curriculum. So, and I really say that, like, one of the things is, know who your audience is. And I often write towards race scholars to get them to understand how racism and ableism work together. So it's not necessarily people who don't believe in racism. Like, I'm not trying to convince people racism exists. Like, you should read other work to do that, right? But race scholars often talk about, like, they're coming up with such creative ways, like hip hop pedagogy, and there's ethnic studies, which is so powerful, and so many of these kind of shifts away from a whitewashed Eurocentric curriculum. So that is one shift that they've done, and what I argue is, like, that's awesome, and let's think about who we're leaving out. So, or what even the stories we're telling of who we include. So the most common one that I think people recognize, does everyone know who Fannie Lou Hamer is? She's, okay, I see some people nodding and some people shaking their head. That's fair. Thank you for being honest. I love it when people are honest. Fannie Lou Hamer is often considered the mother of the civil rights movement. She was beaten severely in a Mississippi jail. She was really well known in the Mississippi Democratic Freedom Party. So anyway, she's like one of the mothers of the civil rights movement, around the same time as Martin Luther King, of course, less well known, but still super, super powerful. And a lot of people in these kind of like hip hop pedagogies and everything else do teach about Fannie Lou Hamer, which is great. But a lot of times they leave out parts of her story. So for example, she had polio as a child. So she actually always had a limp, and that severe beating in a Mississippi jail made that limp so much worse she struggled to walk. Why don't we ever talk about that? Are we ashamed that Fannie Lou Hamer couldn't walk? Is that something where, or struggled to walk? Are we trying to protect her legacy in some way by presenting her as non-disabled? It's not that we have to claim a disability identity for her, but we have to understand how it impacted her organizing. So, and plus what her disability tells you about her world. So one, having polio as a child, right? Polio, like COVID, is not something that hit every community equally. Polio was really, really actually big in Black communities because we didn't have the same access to healthcare, right? So that makes sense. And the other thing is, so that was polio, and then getting beaten in a Mississippi jail for standing up for civil rights, right? So also it's a reminder that when you resist structural inequities, you can get killed for them or you can become disabled from them. So first of all, her story tells that story. Another thing that happened to Fannie Lou Hamer is she was forcibly sterilized in the 1950s. And this was so common in the 1950s for Black women who would go in for an appendix or something minor and come out not knowing that they had been sterilized, that they started calling it the Mississippi appendectomy. So, and Fannie Lou Hamer actually brought attention to that. So again, like really making sure that we understanding how intersectional or how deeply thoughtful her organizing was. It wasn't just this kind of like one-off, and she was like really well known for pulling up a chair and just sitting with youth and talking. Well, maybe that was because that was physically what she needed to do in order, but it changed the way she organized. So again, it's a beautiful thing. It's a part of her story, but what we see is some of her humanity getting erased when we leave that part of the story out. So again, just having really thinking about how we include stories, who we include, all of that, really important. So that's one way folks are doing it. People are doing a lot of really creative work to rethink these things. So I think like Mike Hines, who's at the Stanford Graduate School of Education, is working with SFUSD to update their ethnic studies, right? People are pushing for ethnic studies across the country. There are several things that are being done. We're pushing to get our, discipline rethought and how we think about discipline. Some people are pushing on how to get cops out of schools, cops off campus, right? There's a push to get cops off campus at Stanford that starts on May 3rd with Abolition May. So if you all are interested, there's work to be done, and there's places in that you all can get involved without having to start all over and learn a whole bunch of new things if you're interested.
Thanks. Abby Mulligan next, please.
Hi, thank you for your talk. I was wondering if there were any new educational philosophies. For example, I was thinking of like the growth mindset that have been used by teachers as kind of excuses to not support their students in the way they need to. I know that potentially a lot of these educational philosophies have been built in white classrooms and by white teachers, not considering the structural racism that's pervasive.
Oh, Abby, such a good question. And yeah, I mean, I think so many of the things, growth mindset's a great one. Grit is another one that a lot of us are like, what is this? Because grit is this idea that you just try harder, right? And ignores all of the structural things that are happening around. I think there's a lot of these kind of deficit rooted, individualized ways of looking at students that are about individual effort that take away all of the context. Right? And you can't take away the context. That's why I say you can't be color evasive, because again, and to be clear, I'm a former teacher. I'm a public school teacher for 8 years. And I do think I made a lot of mistakes. So a lot of this work is to try to right the wrongs that I did in a classroom. It's not just white teachers are bad and black and brown teachers are good. We all are raised in the system of white supremacy. If we don't examine it, we pull it forward. That's just how it works. So it's understanding what teachers can do differently, but like, I don't get up in the morning thinking, oh, those evil teachers, they're out to get kids, right? Like, that's not it. Most teachers come thinking, oh, I can't wait to make a difference today. I'm trying to help my kids. Like, they are not out to get kids, but they still are harming kids because they are so color evasive, because they're ignoring the ways that they reproduce white supremacy in their classrooms. And so what I want people to think about is how do you pull away from that? And you pull away from that by starting to, instead of evading race, because again, it might seem like something you're just doing because you don't want to talk about, makes you uncomfortable, but that is a power move. It's reproducing power in your classroom. So it's really thinking about how we start recognizing racial disparities that are happening, and then thinking about how we reproduce them. So like, I always give people just like the most basic of ideas. When you give out rewards in your classroom, you should note who you give them to. Because if you actually kept track, you'd be surprised. And it's just like tiny little things like that. How do we describe kids? How do we do this that where our stuff is reproduced? And it's not teachers going, I'm gonna get the black kid today. It's teachers that are just doing a million other things, but that's how ideology works, right? Ideology is not moved forward by every person announcing that they are going to be a big meanie. It's that you have things in your head that make you think a certain way. And that doesn't mean there's no teachers with explicit bias, because there certainly are. And those teachers have to get out of the classroom. Like, if you are hanging a noose and you think that's funny, or you're saying build the wall, you need to be out of the classroom. You are a problem. You are harming students. And so just to be clear, I'm not excusing all of that, but I am saying I think people need to be able to study their practice. And if they studied their practice, they could, and that's part of, we need to provide teachers the time for that, because teachers are often not given that opportunity.
So next, I'd like to call on one of the people who really keeps a smile on my face at Stanford, and that's Tracy Hines. You willing to talk?
Okay, I was just telling Paul that my son was actually in special education his entire school, thing, and that some of the students that didn't have parents that advocated for them, they were treated differently. And I can say that he never had a teacher that looked like you, never had anybody on his IEP panel board that looked like you. I really had to make sure that the teachers stopped saying, your son is never going to be able to. And I said, no, you can't ever tell him that. I said, because only God knows what he's going to be able to do. So I learned to be a really strong advocate for him. So I think that a lot of people that have children in special education don't know how to work within the system and how to advocate for their children. They just tell you that your kid's in special education and that's it. And then you just have to kind of figure it out on your own what to do. So I just wanted to thank you for actually being a special education teacher, because we need more teachers that look like you, and for more teachers that really want to do that. Because it's not an easy job, because you have so many different levels of disability in your classroom. So I just wanted to make that comment. Thank you, Paul.
Yeah, it's a pleasure. And you know, my own son is neurodivergent, and even though he's in a place where he should have all the support in the world, I see that every day. Teachers who don't really get what he's going through and don't really believe what they hear.
Thank you, Tracy and Paul. Thank you for sharing your experiences. I think that matters so much. And I think, you know, I just want to add, like, A, thank you as parents for being involved, and B, you shouldn't have to be this involved. People don't have the resources, the time, the energy, because they pay their taxes and they think, I trust my kid at school. I trust my kid at school. One of the things that we find happens, you know, there's this huge, you know, conversation about overrepresentation of Black kids in special ed. And it's an important conversation to have. I'm not trying to get rid of that conversation, but I also think we've overemphasized it to the point that we're kind of arguing now we just want proportional representation. Like, if, you know, so if, just to be clear, if what overrepresentation is if there's 14% of Black kids in schools, there should be 14% of Black kids in special ed theoretically, but there's not, there's a higher percentage. So that's overrepresentation. But the focus on overrepresentation implies that if we had a perfect proportional representation, then everything would be great. But Tracy's comments actually show us why that's not true. Because what happens is, for whatever reason, when kids end up going into those space, their race is ignored and their disability becomes the only label they see. And then that disability label is a disability that's rooted in what it's viewed as something they cannot do. But like, what would happen if you just, you know, that's why I always make the argument when we talk about color blindness. Like, first of all, it's based on a false assumption that blindness is equal with ignorance, when really blind people understand the world in a way that I never could. Like, what if we just understood disability as another way to see the world? That doesn't mean we have to stop talking about disability or pretend it doesn't exist. That's not what I'm saying either, but we want to just stop pretending it's all about the deficit, right? And that's what we want to think through, is that. And so, and Tracy's again giving us a reminder that, like, what we can't do is once kids enter into special ed, suddenly pretend their race doesn't matter and that disability is the only thing that matters. So like, a great example is like SFUSD, right? And I'm not picking on a particular district, I just work with them. But one of the things that I found is, like, we have these schools with this beautiful anti-racist curriculum, and I'll say, great, this is amazing. What's happening in the special ed classroom? Oh, they don't get anti-racist curriculum. I'm sorry, can you explain why? Oh, because they're working on things related to their disability. Still Black though, right? Still Black. So we can't actually get rid of the anti-racist. Like, you don't not need anti-racist curriculum because you have a disability. In fact, some of us would argue you need it even more. You need it even more because we know disabled people of color are some of the most common folks to get shot by police. We know that disabled people of color are some of them have even lower experiences with quality employment, with finding decent housing, right? So again, disabled folks of color are not protected by going into a special education system that treats them as white children that are just not doing as well. So I think Tracy's comments are so useful. So thanks, Tracy, for sharing that.
Jasmine, over to you.
Yeah, well, it's actually almost a perfect segue. I would love to call on Racheska, who has a question about language in the context of these classrooms as well. So Racheska, over to you.
Thank you so much for speaking with us today regarding this very important topic. I kind of just wanted to ask, how might this issue be exacerbated by the language barrier or being of immigrant background? Growing up, I remember in my K-12 years, several of my peers who were with me in the kind of ELD program at my schools, who weren't like native English speakers or English proficient at that time, were constantly hyper surveilled, hyper labeled, and treated through like this ableist lens by our teachers who were predominantly white. And so I was just really wondering, how might the issue be exacerbated or kind of influenced by that?
Francesca, that's an amazing question. And I'm just, we're here snapping because that's what I do when I get excited and like, yes, right on. That's the question you should be asking. And thank you for sharing your own experience and how you saw this play out. So absolutely, this is something we need to think through, right? So I'm not, to be clear, I have a master's in special ed and ESL, and English as a second language. And the reason I went was because I was teaching at a predominantly Latinx high school, and there was a lot of conversations, is this a disability or is this a language issue, right? And so there was that, but there was also a lot of that where kids are locked into English language learner. And in California, there's a particular category called the LTEL, the long-term English language learner, where you stay for a certain amount of years and you just get tracked into these low kind of classes. You get, you don't get support. So similar, it's a parallel system. It's not the exact same, but it's parallel to special ed where you just get peeled out. And that's kind of what American education is set up to do. It's to peel out everybody except for the direct middle. And then put them in their own segregated settings and then wonder why they're not learning with reductive curriculum, problematic pedagogy, and punishing relationships. And then we wonder why those kids aren't advancing, right? All No Child Left Behind did is tell us what we already know. It's testing to show what we already know, which is that certain kids are not advancing. It's spending more money on tests instead of their education. And so, I think you're off to a great start. So Jonathan Rosa, who's in the School of Education, has a whole concept called ratiolinguistics. I highly suggest you check out his work, and also his writing partner, kind of co-partner, they write together all the time, they're co-authors, is Nelson Flores at UPenn. And I think, I don't know if it's UPenn or Penn State. I'm a bad academic. I don't always know the difference between schools. But anyway, he's at one of those Pennsylvania schools. And like I said, they're thinking about ratiolinguistics. And there are some early career scholars who are also thinking about this. So Maria Xiao Pena is thinking about this. She just had a book come out about bilingual students in special education and their mothers. Jennifer Fuong is just about to graduate and is doing this work. Valentina Miglerini, who is in London, but also doing this work. Sylvia Nigenye. So my point is there are lots of people who are starting to think about this, but it's a really early field. So if you're interested, there's definitely work being done around, and Guadalupe Valdez, another person at the Stanford Graduate School of Ed who's thinking about these things.
Thank you for that wonderful resource list and I feel like I say this every talk. Each one of your questions, students, could be its own thesis. So if you're interested in these things, please pursue them. I will say my PhD came out of a question that I asked in a seminar when I was an undergrad. So these questions matter, keep track of them. So next I would like to call on Cameron.
I just had a question about kind of building off of a previous question on kind of new approaches in the classroom and in schools. But how has the implementation of transformative and or restorative justice programs in some schools impacted racial disparities in student disciplinary, and kind of any significant trends or connections to the school-prison nexus?
Oh, thanks, Cameron. And I also saw that you were the person in the chat who mentioned Push Out, Monique Morris's book, which I highly recommend, really focused on Black girls and how they're uniquely pushed out of schools, builds on Kimberly Crenshaw's work, who created the kind of concept of intersectionality. Well, she created the term intersectionality. The concept, of course, has a much longer lineage in Black feminism. But I just wanted to shout out that you have read that book. It's a great book. So, you know, I think that restorative justice is like any other tool. So, and what I mean by that is restorative justice, meditation, mindfulness, social, emotional, all of these new things that are coming in to try to reduce discipline disparities, right? I think that all of them can be done well and robustly, and they can be done thin and poorly. And one of the reasons a lot of those examples are thin and poor is because, again, they are color evasive. So if you don't have the root of understanding racism and the multiple intersecting oppressions like ableism that are in a school and that cause discipline disparities, I don't think you can actually address discipline disparities by race. Like, it's like trying to like say, I'm going to address, you know, I don't want to use a disease metaphor, but I'm going to address like the fact that this house has a spot of paint missing by changing a light bulb, right? Like, I'm going to introduce a new thing, but I'm not going to fix the thing, right? And that thing isn't going to address the thing, but maybe the light will shine a little differently on it, okay? And I'm going pretty far with this metaphor, but what I mean is just, you know, restorative justice on its own, I mean, it has really beautiful possibilities. It was originally rooted in indigenous communities. I mean, the ideas are really beautiful. And then it got kind of, you know, burrowed down and gnawed down to this like thing that you can pick up and drop into anybody's school without understanding the actual racial disparities that are in that school, how they're being caused. It's really similar to positive behavior supports. So positive behavior supports, which are also a form of behaviorism, right? They got dropped into schools and everyone's like, look, they're reducing discipline. And they were. It reduced discipline, but it didn't reduce discipline disparities and the disparity between Black and white kids, right? So then they called it culturally responsive. So they dropped culturally responsive on top of positive behavior supports. For some people that's worked, for some people it hasn't. So similarly, restorative justice could be that. I think it's very different when it's actually thought of as transformative justice, because transformative justice is actually supposed to address the sociocultural context, not just the individual behaviors. So I think that could have the possibility, but that context, you have to say words like racism and ableism and sexism and cis heteropatriarchy and all of those fun words that we've learned to say. You have to say, how are these things being addressed? How does classism part of this? How is, you know, so I think all of those things have lots of potential, but I think that that potential will only go as far as if we decide we're going to evade intersecting oppressions or we're going to talk about them.
Wow. Well, this has been an amazing session. We have just a minute left, so I think we'll stop here. And really, I learned a lot from this, Subini. This is really, really interesting, and you know, of course, sad for the kids that you've had to watch suffer all this. But thank you so much for your time and for the great talk you gave, and I'm sure I speak for everybody else in recognizing the value of what you're doing. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I really appreciate you all coming. I know it's late. Go home, get some rest. Thank you so much. And yeah, and just remember with those kids, it's though they are sad stories, and they are. I also want us to always remember how resistant and thoughtful kids are. And I want us to think about how to build systems and solutions that meet their needs. So again, there are lots of different ways to get involved. If you're interested, feel free to reach out to me.